Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
The GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, your go-to network for all sorts of podcasts. Pretty much, if you want to find a podcast, just type in GSMC and then the thing that you want to listen to. They make it pretty easy to find stuff. So, check out some of our other podcasts. This is the Science Fiction Podcast. I'm your host, Keith. And it's Wednesday, which means we're not talking about Hyperion, which is what we've been doing for the last, 2 to 3 months, I think. It's been a little while on Sundays. Sundays are Hyperion days. Even Father's Day was really just Hyperion Day. So this week we are actually talking about a movie that is on Amazon Prime that generally has received a lot of good reviews, I guess. I'd say it's mixed. In the critical community, a lot of people really like this film. I don't know why. I mean, I guess I can understand why, but also I don't know why. It has its moments, but overall I was not terribly impressed, but we'll talk about the whole thing. The movie is called High Life. It stars Robert Pattinson, and Andre 3000 is in it, which is super fun. And it is directed by Claire Denis, who is a French director and writer. I would call her art house, and quintessential art house would be the way that I would describe her. Her big movies are... it's French, so forgive me if I butcher it. Travail, B-E-A-U, which I want to say is be or bow or beau. Travail would be my guess. Totally not sure. That came out in 1999, and then another film that she's kind of well known for is 35 Shots of Rum, which came out in 2008. So... I haven't seen either of those films. If there's one thing that I will say about this film, it definitely makes me want to watch her other films to see if they're also equally weird and wacky. At the top of the episode, I just want to mention again, and I didn't know this going into the film. I just happened to stumble upon this film when I was looking for something to talk about. It is definitely deserving of its rating. There is a lot of sexually explicit content in it. There is also assault in it. There's violence, against both genders. So, definitely a trigger warning for this one. It gets pretty intense a couple times, and not even in a useful way, which is, anyway, we'll talk about that later. But, definitely, if you're going in to watch this movie, honestly, I think listening to the podcast will really help prepare you for it, or listening to somebody's podcast or reading a review of it or something. I like that I went in with blinders, but also the thing about a lot of art house movies is that people will be like, oh, you need to just watch it. Don't read anything about it. And sometimes that works out really well with, for me, anything by Yorgos Lanthimos. I think that's his last name. He's the Greek director who did The Killing of a Sacred Deer and The Lobster, both of which are amazing films, and I went into them totally blind, and they were incredible. They profoundly touched me. So, which is funny to say because neither of those films are particularly like touching. Either way, going into those blind was really great, but with this one, I would say I would definitely recommend, like, you know, like I just said, reading a review or doing something along those lines to be sure that you kind of know what you're getting yourself into, as it were. So the film's premise is basically that Earth is dying, which is pretty standard in a science fiction world. Earth is dying, and in order to save Earth, they need to find a new source of like energy, hypothetically. I don't think that the Earth is necessarily dying at like a rapid, immediate pace. I think it's just dying at a pace at which like something needs to be done. So the new government of like the planet decides, or at least of some area, decides that what they're going to start doing is sending their death row inmates on space missions, to like go to a black hole and see if they can get their ship to like orbit it accordingly so that they can harvest the energy of like the movement in some way, in some capacity. It's a pretty, I guess, far-fetched premise just to like start out. I don't want to just spend the whole time critiquing this film, but like there's a lot to critique. Like just from a writing perspective, there's a lot of things that this film just like does not do well. Just like the premise alone. As far as suspension of disbelief is concerned, they kind of like, I guess, I don't want to say like non-bow, like as in like they don't combo well with themselves, but they really don't. Because on one hand, they are talking about the mission and they say, you know, these people are so far away at this point from Earth that their transmissions are going to take years to come back to us. And by the time the transmissions even reach the Earth, there's a scientist who says we will literally be bone dust. And so it doesn't really make any sense that they would send death row. Like, they have the capability of space travel. They can survive in space for an indefinite amount of time. And instead of deciding to leave Earth in search of new planets to live on with this technology, they decide that what would be best would be to send death row inmates to try and get energy from black holes in order to save the planet. That doesn't make any logical sense. So the suspension of disbelief at the onset of the film is like really, really, really high, and there's not anything in the film that like makes you like feel inclined to actually buy into it, which is just I don't know. I really want to know. Honestly, when watching this film, it felt kind of like the director and the writer, I believe they're the same person. It almost felt like, in a way, they kind of just phoned it in. Like, oh, I'm a successful art house director, so I'm just going to put this movie out just to see if, like, people will watch it just because my name's attached to it. And that's really how it felt. And like Robert Pattinson did do a great job acting. Like every actor and actress in this film was like, they did a good job. It's just that like there are bits of dialogue. Anyway, no, I need to stay focused. It's just that really there's a lot of bad things to talk about in this movie. And I wanted to like it. I really did. And I'll probably get to some stuff that I thought they did well, but regardless, the premise is trash, in my opinion. The premise does not make any sense with the dialogue that they give during other parts of the film. It's like, I just don't understand. You have space travel, it's a science fiction movie, and what you do is you send death row inmates out into space on a collision course for nowhere. Like they literally are just going in one direction at infinity. And like, sure, that could possibly be a really interesting metaphor for like the way that human beings seek out knowledge, or something about the human experience is that like we're constantly trudging forward in this Sisyphean task that has no end, and ultimately like we're just going to die and nothing will have come from it. And our children will die and nothing will have come from that. And like very existential, very sad. But like there's no like hope or meaning. And like I can kind of appreciate the fact that she did that because it feels very spacey. It's like, oh, space is nothing. There's just like it's like the root of life, and at the root of life there is nothing. And like I could understand that being one of the points that the film is trying to make, but like, do I think that it's a great point to spend 2 hours on? Not necessarily. Could have done it in 10 minutes and given us a short film. So to start, just the premise is not great. Anyway, I'll finish the summary of the movie. So the new government has decided they're going to send death row inmates on a one-way trip into deep space in order to find a black hole, which is located just outside of the solar system that we exist in. So just outside of the Milky Way, I think is what they call our solar system. Whatever. So just outside of our solar system is a black hole that they're going to try to harvest energy from. They they send out a bunch of ships with all these death row inmates on them. And Robert Pattinson's character is a death row inmate. He is an orphan or a homeless kid who's been homeless. I think he's an orphan, who's been an orphan for his entire life. And he kills someone, I think, and ends up on death row just because he's kind of like just an outcast in general from society. Yeah, don't cut yourself on that edge, art film director. Sorry. I really wanted to like this movie. So he gets sentenced to death, and then he gets thrown on a spaceship with a bunch of other death row inmates, and they are, I don't know, corralled, I guess would be what I would call it, for lack of another word, by a woman by the name of Dr. Gibbs or Dibbs, I can't remember. And she has this obsession with fertility and children, which, I mean, it is a female director, and like I'm not saying that like only women handle this particular subject matter, but like the way in which it's handled feels very personal, in a really weird way. It definitely is an alternative interpretation of what an extreme of someone who was very obsessed with that particular aspect of human life. It's definitely an alternative take on it from what you would probably be used to, which is one of the reasons why I really love watching movies that are directed by people who don't look exactly like me. So, and I don't want to say that that's like, the gap and the experience gap is part of why I like maybe don't understand the movie as well as I would like to. But I did watch it with a female friend, and she said she shared similar sentiments to what I thought of the film in the first place. So that's neither here nor there. This is all just my opinion in the end anyway. So Dibbs or Gibbs runs the ship. There are a few male inmates and a few female inmates. And then there's a captain, but they're all death row prisoners. So like even the Dr. Gibbs or Dr. Dibbs and the captain are both death row inmates. And so they're still privy to the punishment, I guess, which doesn't make any sense to me, because like if you're going to send a bunch of prisoners out into space, a bunch of people who have like murdered and like raped and assaulted and done all these awful heinous things to other people, and they're supposed to like follow rules without anyone being there to enforce them, and like I don't know. There's a philosopher who has a specific system of thought regarding punishment, and I'll talk about it right after this quick commercial break that we're about to take, but it might explain part of what it is that this woman is trying to say. He is also French, so anyway, we'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's GSMCpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
I was kind of talking about, well, I was bashing on this movie, which is High Life again, in case we had forgotten what movie it was. And I was talking about how ridiculous the premise of a bunch of death row inmates taking orders from other death row inmates would be on a space mission. I guess they do kind of try to address why it is that they all fall in line by saying, like, I don't know, if you don't do what you're supposed to, you'll die because the life support systems will turn off. But, like, that would also kill the people who are in charge. So I'm not really sure exactly. Anyway, I think that the director, I don't know, I want to hope for the best and that she was intentionally using a specific system of like philosophy written by a gentleman, I believe it's written by a gentleman named Michel Foucault, and it's called the Panopticon. And it's this philosophical idea that it's a prison system where it's like a large circle, and in the center of the circle is a tower. And in that tower is like a surveillance system of some kind, or like, you know, it's just a large tower of windows or something like that. But all of the prison cells have open doors, but everybody still stays in the cell because they can be seen by the person who is in the center of the prison. And so, but they don't know if that person is actually there or not. And I think that this is Foucault's way of trying to explain, like, the idea of, like, probably of Santa Claus, or of, like, the way that a lot of people view religion would be another probably commentary that that Foucault is trying to make, and therefore also Claire Denis is trying to make. So that's definitely interesting to take note of, because she does kind of invoke that particular way of thought by, like, in the beginning, Robert Pattinson decides that he is going to toss. It seems like a lot of people are in stasis on the ship as they, like, get close to death or actually die. You put them in, like, this little stasis bag, I guess, that's supposed to keep them alive perpetually, which doesn't make any sense. They're literally not hooked up to anything. It's basically just like, it seems like they're put into, like, this medically induced coma and then put in a bag. But, like, if you're in a medically induced coma, I don't know. There's just the suspension of disbelief necessary to believe that this film is a science fiction film is astronomical. Anyway, that's not necessarily what we're here to talk about. So they're in these bags, and Robert Pattinson decides that he's going to toss them overboard because he wants to conserve as much energy as possible. Because I don't know. It doesn't really seem like energy is an issue. It doesn't seem like they're taking up any like fluids or anything like that. Like I said, they're literally not attached to anything. But it is what it is. So I kind of lost my train of thought because I just realized, I don't know, every time I go to talk about something in this film, I realize more and more that like there's just more stuff that doesn't make any sense. Even if like the point of the movie is just symbolic metaphor and space is a vessel for that. Like, there's no level of, I guess, I don't want to say like continuity, but there's just no level of like effort into soliciting buy-in from the audience. Like, it really feels like the person who directed this had no place trying to make a science fiction movie, regardless. So Robert Pattinson decides to toss these people out of the lock, and when he does so, he records it in the record log and says, like, I know the consequences of doing this, and I don't care, because by the time you get this message, you'll probably, like, I'll be dead, is probably what the assumption is. And so that is kind of like evidence to the idea that there like is in the back of his mind still some sort of consequence that he can suffer that would cause him to be in a place of, I don't know, greater pain or be worse off than he currently is, which doesn't really seem possible because he's literally careening to his death into nothingness. And that is something that, like, the premise is interesting in that capacity that I do want to mention, is in like Hyperion and a lot of other philosophical idea structures, one of the things that people want to avoid at almost all costs is this idea of like existence into perpetuity, and that existence being like guaranteed. So with Hyperion, there's the Pecora from the first book, and they get revived every single time they die, and every single time they get revived, they lose a bit of themselves. And so like the idea is that immortality ultimately causes the loss of self. And so this film kind of takes the opposite direction and says like your death is inevitable and you cannot avoid it. And it is like this haunting, silent specter of space that is just like infinite. So death is infinite and you are finite. And so what do you do with that? And so it kind of gives like this heightened meaning to every single interaction and every single thing that someone does when they're in the spaceship, which is why I think like a lot of individuals get these almost unhealthy obsessions with things on the ship, or like with the idea of achieving something. So Dr. Gibbs, who is obsessed with fertility, is trying to artificially impregnate the female members, the female inmates. So what she does is she kind of like holds resources hostage and then forces the men to go into a room and donate some of their fluids, would be the best way to phrase it. Yes, like I said, this movie is really messed up. And so she then goes through those fluids and finds like ideal specimens, and then tries to artificially impregnate the female inmates on the ship in order to like create a perfect baby, is kind of what seems to be indicated to me. But like she only seems to be working with one half of the equation, which is like the male half. There's no indication that she's done any kind of like research into the level of genetic viability in the female half. It just is like assumed that if she gets a good male specimen, then she'll be able to create a baby or a fetus that will survive the radiation that's constantly berating their ship. And like, how it is that they're not all dying of radiation poisoning is crazy to me, because like one guy gets leukemia, and then they talk about how the radiation kills all of the babies, but then no one else seems to be suffering from any kind of radiation poisoning. And if they are, it's like so elongated that you almost can't even tell, which ultimately doesn't make any gosh darn sense. So I don't even know why it's included that's what is killing the fetuses. It just, again, I don't think that believability was at top of mind when it came to this film. I think that there is just a specific like group of messages and commentaries that are trying to be portrayed, and so the level of suspension of disbelief that is expected of the audience is pretty high because they just don't try to explain anything, which is part of why I think this film is really, in my opinion, not good. It just gets a lot of clout because of the director, which is cool. Good for her. Like, you know, I'm sure that her other movies are great. Like, I do want to watch them. This movie made me want to watch her other films, but like, it's not a standalone. Like, it's not a great piece of art by any means, in my opinion. It's just, and I'm sure that there are lots of people who will be able to get past my frustrations with it and enjoy it. But the level of suspension of disbelief is just too high. And the payoff for that suspension of disbelief is non-existent, which, like, again, can be a good thing, but in this particular instance, I don't believe it to be a good thing. And so that is like one of my many frustrations with the film. But regardless, we'll kind of like start summarizing the plot a little bit and walking you through the movie, since that's part of what I'm here to do. So the movie is apparently told mainly through like flashbacks, but the timeline is not very effective, I would say, because towards the film starts with Pattinson interacting with a baby, and then it flashes back to his time on Earth very briefly, and like this girl and his dog, and then how he kind of started becoming a part of the incarceration system, and how like he grew up basically living in that space, living as an incarcerated individual for like his entire life, childhood, everything. He was constantly in and out of like jail and things like that, apparently. And then the flashbacks progress to him being on the ship with the other inmates, and it doesn't really seem like there's a timeline necessarily with those. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he is on the ship with a teenage girl, and it's pretty obvious, like it's not super obvious that the teenage girl is his daughter grown up, but like it eventually becomes a little more obvious. There is some indication that because they're traveling at the speed of light, aging is different, and so like they won't age in the same way that people on Earth will age, which is like, I don't know, like why even bother including that? It doesn't make any sense to me why they would say that. I don't know. I really honestly have no idea what was going on in this movie, and not in a good way. There are definitely films where it's like, I don't know what's going on, but this is powerful. Like The Killing of a Sacred Deer. There's a ton of things in that movie that are just like absolutely not explained in any capacity. Like, how is this person accomplishing these things? Where is this coming from? And like eventually you as an audience member just have to be like, it's just happening. And that's like kind of part of the movie. But like in this movie, that's not like it's just happening expectation doesn't line up with like any kind of real human behavior. And so I just don't feel like the movie was getting at anything profoundly human, which is like the number one reason to watch almost any movie, is that it portrays something profoundly interesting about the human experience. But anyway, so the timeline's a little jumpy. And what we find out is that Dr. Gibbs is lovers with the captain of the ship, and the captain of the ship is dying of leukemia, and we find out that she is like I had mentioned earlier, kind of like taking advantage of the other prisoners and trying to artificially impregnate another female prisoner. which if she had wanted to, I don't know, not use herself as well, just like as many viable bodies as possible is what makes sense. Regardless, there's a lot of tension surrounding that, and apparently she is able to like convince them to do certain things, and she like puts sedative in the water supply to like get them to do her bidding, I guess would be, for lack of another word. There's a garden on the ship, which is returned to quite a lot. There's a ton of biblical imagery and biblical allegory and allusion in this film, and I'm definitely going to talk about that, along with other summaries of the plot right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Imagery, allusion, and allegory that happens within this film. That film being High Life. I've said it a couple times. It's funny. There is definitely one weed reference in the entire film. It is just as out of place as other statements are. There's some just really weird and random statements thrown into this whole film. There's a woman who's called a big booty girl, and it's like completely and totally out of place. It doesn't fit with the mood of this film at all, which I find to be, well, I want it to be hilarious, but I really don't even know what to do with it at this point, if I'm being super honest. It's just so ridiculous. Anyway. So Bible stuff. So obviously there's like this beautiful garden on the ship. The story opens with it, and I mean, I'm pretty sure that it's supposed to be like the Garden of Eden in a way. It's kind of like I think there's supposed to be like a journey to knowledge or understanding somewhere in this film, as to what it is that they come to knowledge of, and what the purpose of the journey is. I can't really say, which is, again, can be a good thing, but in this particular instance, I would be inclined to think that it really isn't, because there's like a lot to this and nothing to it at all. And like, I'm pretty sure that is part of the point of the film, but that doesn't mean that it's good. So, obviously we've got the Garden of Eden. Robert Pattinson's character commits his first murder, maybe his only murder, I'm not totally sure, with a rock, which kind of harkens to Cain and Abel. There is a lot of ritual in this. In the beginning of the film, when Pattinson decides to throw everybody out into space, he does put them in their spacesuits, as kind of like, I think kind of like death shrouds type of a thing, Because it's not as if they're going to, like, wake up. They're just, well, I mean, they might wake up eventually. Who knows? I don't know exactly how space works in this particular universe or how their spacesuits work. Like, literally how their spacesuits work at all. They look like they're made of cloth and that they're, like, there are sections of it that are super porous. But then there's, like, metal rings that make it seem as if it has a vacuum seal on it. Your guess is as good as mine. He even tapes up the hands of one of the people that he tosses out into space because he's missing a pair of gloves, which I don't know how he ended up missing a pair of gloves. I also don't know why there would be consistency in the writing with that particular bit of the movie, but, like, there's no consistency in other portions, but we'll get to that eventually. We're on the Bible thing right now. There is kind of like an indication of like a Sodom and Gomorrah kind of type story, mainly because there's kind of this weird, the story of Lot implication that's happening here. And I don't know how well versed in, like, it's funny. This story is just often completely overlooked because it is pretty heinous. It's from the Bible. When Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, Lot takes his wife and 2 daughters out into the wilderness away from the cities, and God gives specific instructions that says that if anyone turns around to look at the city, then they'll be turned into a pillar of salt. So what does Lot's wife do? She turns around and looks at the city when it's burning and gets turned into a pillar of salt. So Lot and his 2 daughters are the only ones left from the cities. His 2 daughters, believing that they are the only 2 women and their father is the only man left on the entire planet, decide to get him drunk and take advantage of him so that they may become pregnant and restart the human race. Even though, like, Abraham's literally just up the street being like, hey, you guys can come over now, because Lot is related to Abraham. I don't understand this story. I don't even know if it's technically historic. I would have to look at, I don't know, the style of the original text in order to acquire that information. Ask a Jewish theologian. I am not one. Regardless, you know where this is going. There's a little bit of a weirdness between Robert Pattinson and his daughter once she's grown up. She's a teenager. He wakes up, catches her sleeping in the same bed as him because that's what she's used to, because she was a little girl at some point. And she is experiencing her lady time for the first time, and he doesn't explain to her what's going on at all. So I don't even know what the purpose of that was. There is a mention, I think there's a mention of, like, when I was a child, I thought like a child, and now I'm a man, so I think like a man. I'm pretty sure that's in there somewhere. The idea of abstinence runs pretty heavily through the second act of the film, which if there is one thing that this film does, it's divide its acts very effectively between acts 1, 2, and 3. Like, there's a hard line that you can absolutely tell that they're transitioning. In the second act, we find out that in addition to Gibbs taking samples from the male inmates, that she is also in fact, or that there is in fact a room where they can go and kind of like experience intercourse would be the word that I'm looking for in some capacity. And Pattinson's character eventually decides that he's no longer going to participate in any of those things, so he just kind of like stops exerting that particular force. And so they start calling him like a monk, which doesn't make any sense. But regardless, that seems to be an important plot point. And then there's this idea that intercourse is exclusively reserved for reproduction and is not like purposeful outside of that. That's what self-care, quote unquote, is for. Trying to keep this PG, everybody. Even though this movie is definitely rated R. So there's definitely just, I don't know, that like there's a little bit of biblical things there, but like I would guess there's supposed to be some religious commentary. The Dr. Gibbs figure kind of is like a shaman in a weird way, and they even call her that, like a shaman of fertility, because she believes that she's going to like achieve some sort of perfection by using her methods, which don't make a single bit of sense, and doesn't make a single bit of sense because, again, like, it's not like she's collecting specimens from both sides. She's collecting it from one side and then selecting, apparently, and then trying to artificially impregnate the female inmates. There are some scenes where, like, a woman tries to fly into the black hole that they're passing, and she dies, and it's like completely anticlimactic and like totally purposeless. Didn't make any sense at all. There are 2 assault scenes, like straight back to back, where one of the male inmates decides that he's going to go and assault a female inmate, and that is stopped, at least at some point. And then there is a scene immediately following where Gibbs is putting in extra sedative into the water supply to knock everybody out, and then she goes and actually takes advantage of Robert Pattinson's character so that she can acquire his sample, if that makes sense. And so that is just a lot of messed upness, but it's also, it feels very Old Testament-y because there's just like a lot of violence. And I don't know, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose in the grand scheme of things. That is how she gets the sample that makes it so that she can make Robert Pattinson's child eventually. And then we're like, you know, like I said, there's no good continuity in this storyline, in the plot. It kind of just like bounces all over the place, and it's hard to tell. And you know, like I would think that like, oh, the director is trying to make a commentary on the way that time passes and how we view it as this like linear thing, but it's really kind of like cyclical, and it's all happening at once. But like, it doesn't really seem to be what her goal is. And like, as you get towards the end of the film, it doesn't really seem like it's her goal to say like anything interesting. There's a couple scenes where like it feels like she's almost trying to get at something of value by like portraying the universe as like a sleeping fetus, or like we're watching the solar system or we're watching the solar system change behind us. Like we're watching the sky change. Like basically we're going from one set of stars to a whole new set of stars. And like that should be a big deal. But it's like really lost in the fact that there's just so much like violence and like meaningless violence and like meaningless interactions between individuals. And, like, everything is just so futile. Not futile as in F-E-U-D-A-L, but futile. Because, like, there's no way for anybody to get back to Earth. And, like, even if they were to acquire the information that they wanted to, it's already been said that, like, that information won't reach Earth for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, like, there's really no point to the mission at all anymore. They basically were just, like, sent out to their doom. And it, like, I guess you could view it as, like, some sort of weird purgatory where, like, they make payments for their sins on Earth, and that's, like, part of how it is that they achieve enlightenment or achieve, like, get to heaven. Again, there's a lot of, like, biblical stuff in this film that I really feel just isn't being leveraged, or it's too much. Like, there's just too many different Bible allegories that they're trying to go for here, and almost all of them are Old Testament, which to me kind of like supports this idea that like they're stuck in like this weird purgatory, because I'm not a Jewish theologian, but I am aware of the fact that they don't really believe in like an afterlife in the same capacity that like Christians do. They think it looks a little bit different. So there's that as well. But as far as like other religions and other like just general religious commentary, it does seem like that is something that the director is going for throughout a lot of the film. Do I think that she actually accomplishes it well? I don't think that she does. Mainly because she doesn't focus on any one thing in particular. Like with Hyperion, they keep on bringing up this idea of like the Abrahamic covenant, where it's established under the premise that Abraham would be willing to kill his only son in order to appease the God that it is that he's claiming to worship. Whereas in this one, like, there is definitely a reference to Abraham, but there's also a reference to Lot. There's also a reference to other Old Testament stories. There's also references to like religious practices in general. And so there's really just like, there's too much going on in a film that doesn't have any consistency within itself. And we're going to talk about some of the inconsistencies that I found to actually be legitimately funny right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Just going to kind of finish up our discussion here. I am just going to spend the last 15 minutes of this podcast, I guess, talking about this movie. And in talking about it, I'm pretty sure you'll understand why, in my opinion, it's not good. So, we haven't really even talked about the plot much. That's partially because there really isn't one. It just like... The premise of the movie, like I mentioned earlier, is like completely outlandish. It doesn't make any sense to a logical human being, in my opinion. And so just like the plot it has this task intrinsic to it, or the premise has this task intrinsic to it that makes no sense, the plot is very similar. So like, the plot doesn't seem to really have a beginning or an end necessarily. I guess there is an end, but like it's very ambiguous, just as you would expect from a movie like this. And that end is also mired in like super, super creepy language between a father and his daughter. And it's like, there's this interesting, there's a few philosophical ideas, kind of like little nuggets, I guess, hidden in here. There's this concept called the tabula rasa, and it's I think it's a Lockean thing, where there's this idea that human beings are born as completely blank slates. So if they're never introduced to a specific concept, then they would have no concept of that thing. And there's one particular scene where I'm thinking of when Willow, who is the little girl's name, is now a teenager interacting with Pattinson. She says, like, that's cruel. That's cruelty. And he says, how do you know what cruelty is? And that's just interesting for him to imply that he's never done anything that would be considered as cruelty, but whatever. There's also this, like, apparently Pattinson is smart enough to, like, manufacture a magnetic panel that he puts on the outside of the ship at the beginning of the movie, which doesn't make any gosh darn sense, because he says explicitly that he, like, didn't go to school and doesn't know how to do all these things. And so, like, how would he know how to... I just don't understand where he would have learned that. Again, the level of suspension of disbelief in this film is egregious. So there's that. And then on top of, or not on top of, in just like, in addition, she has other interactions with the world, like not knowing what's happening when it's that time of the month, referencing like these random movies that play on a TV screen, they're in some part of the ship, and like the movies they look like black and white subliminal messaging, like propaganda that you would see from like 1984 or Clockwork Orange. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if one of those clips is from Clockwork Orange. Just, it seems like something this director would do. And I don't mean that in a good way. And so there's just kind of like this idea, this like little philosophical nugget of like, oh yeah, we started as a blank slate, which I think maybe the director's trying to make a commentary on. I don't know. I don't know what's going on in this movie. If you've watched it and you know what's going on in it, please explain it to me. I get that every interaction is like metaphoric, and symbolic or allegoric of something else. There's like the idea of like your set roles within society. There's an idea of like kind of like predestination, of futility, of fatalism. Anyway, as the plot is going along, you kind of develop a little bit of a relationship between yourself and Pattinson, and you realize that like Gibbs is obsessed with him, which is why she takes advantage of him while he's sedated. And then she reveals to him that the only baby that survived is his, and then after having like kind of completed her work, she decides that she's just going to peace out into space, which doesn't make any sense. We find out that she actually she murdered her children, and that was how she got put on death row. She suffocated them. So it's kind of fitting that she like throws herself into space without a spacesuit, because she would die of lack of oxygen, which is very similar to suffocation in some capacity. But then it seems like there was kind of a period of like an and then there were none type thing going on the ship, as like individuals kind of like died, quote unquote. But they didn't die in the sense that they actually died. They died in the sense that Pattinson just started putting them in these little like life-sustaining bags, and then eventually decides to throw them out into space because he wants to conserve energy for unknown reasons. I don't even know why. And as he's going along in space, like you see it just a little bit of his interactions with his daughter as a baby, and then all of a sudden it goes to a flashback, and then all of a sudden it comes back to him with his daughter as a young adult. And while they're drifting out in space, they bump into another ship, which is numbered 6. Their ship is numbered 7, which is a holy number. I would assume that was like intentional in some capacity. I don't even know. But he decides to like go and try to make contact with whoever's on that ship. He thinks there might be people on there. And what he finds are a bunch of dogs. And the reason that I bring this scene up is because it like Pattinson obviously has like an interesting connection with dogs. It's also like he doesn't bring a puppy back from that ship. And that's why his daughter says that's cruelty, because she says it will die. But what doesn't make any sense to me is that the ship is in total and complete disarray. It looks like the dogs have been running it for, like, who even knows how long? Years, probably. There's, like, rotting dog bodies there and, like, little puppies. So, obviously, the dogs are, like, doing just fine. Eating each other, I think, would be they're eating each other. there's also this idea of like Pattinson specifically says like don't eat your own waste products. That's a Bible thing, especially when it comes to dogs. There's often the reference that dogs return to their own vomit. It's in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. It's a thing. Anyway, that's not the super important part. The important part is that one of the main plot points throughout the movie is that as they're traveling through space, there's a captain's log where you have to file a report on a daily basis, once every 24 hours. Otherwise, the life support systems stop working. And they run into a ship that's numbered 6, and they're number 7, which would imply that number 6 left before them, yet number 7 was ahead of number 6. Or number 6 was slowing down. Or just wandering aimlessly through space. And, like, if it was wandering aimlessly through space, the chances of, like, it's like two plankton finding each other in the middle of the ocean and knowing each other. And, like, even more so than that, because it's literally infinity. Regardless of that, when he goes on the ship, it's just the dogs. So which one of the dogs is the one filing the captain's report at the end of the day so that their life support systems stay on? Like, the continuity, the consistency in this film just is, like, non-existent, and it is so frustrating. Because what does the director want us to do? Assume that, like, there's some sort of, like, extraterrestrial force that's keeping them alive, that, like, God is keeping the dogs alive as, like, a symbolic gesture to show Pattinson's character, whose name is Monty, which, why would you name your character Monty? Whatever. And then the daughter's name is Willow, like, to show them something in specifically, but, like, there's been no indication that God exists in this particular film at all otherwise. And then there's this, like, brief moment where the director tries to get us to, like, understand what it might be like for someone who had grown up, like, completely absent from society to try and make sense of religion. Because there's this scene where Willow is watching what looks like the start of a rugby match, and she's kneeling and praying, and Pattinson's character walks in and goes, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, I saw this on one of the videos that I watch that show images from Earth, and I wanted to know what they were feeling." And he asks who she's praying to, and she says she doesn't know, and it makes sense because how would she know if no one had told her? And I think that that's kind of the point, is that if God did exist, then he would tell us that he exists, even in a space where he wouldn't have to, but that's also not theologically sound, so the commentary there is not really great. I apologize, I'm rambling. I really didn't like this movie. In my opinion, it is not good. I don't know why it is that everybody seems to think that it's worthwhile. Not everybody, just like a lot of critics seem to think that this is a very worthwhile film. You can listen to this podcast and you've got the gist of it, honestly. It really doesn't, like, the cinematography is nothing to write home about. The soundtrack is mediocre, slightly above mediocre. It does what it wants to do just well enough to make it so that you aren't distracted by it, is how I would phrase it, which ultimately, not that great. There are things that are far, far superior. But regardless, that's neither here nor there in that regard. Yeah, my biggest qualms with the movie we'll call it a movie. I don't want to call it a film. Are the dialogue is choppy and artificial. The acting is really good, but the dialogue is not, in my opinion. The cinematography is mediocre at best, as is the soundtrack. The plot in itself is, like, heinously violates suspension of disbelief expectations that a director ought to have, and the premise of the film in itself doesn't make any sense. So really, ultimately, like, I wish that I could have the 2 hours back that I watched this movie during. I'm very frustrated by the fact that like, I watched this and I can't really recommend it. I cannot in good faith recommend this film. You've pretty much heard everything that you need to hear. It's an art house film that does things in kind of an interesting and wacky way that ultimately you and everybody who you love could be far better off without having ever watched, at least in my opinion. And I think that like there is a lot of meaning that you can milk from it because it is an art house film, so everything about it is supposed to just be like this beautiful, open to interpretation metaphor, but like the mediocre dialogue, the ridiculous premise, the inconsistency within the writing and the mechanics of the universe all distract from the fact that like she's trying to do something interesting. Like if you want an art house science fiction movie, go watch Annihilation. Honestly, it is also on Amazon Prime. I've recommended it to all of you guys several times. Annihilation is an incredible, incredible film. Arrival's not on any streaming services, but renting online is super cheap. It's like $2 or $3. And that movie literally changed my life. It was absolutely incredible. The cinematography is to die for. The acting is impeccable. The soundtrack literally would make you weep even if you weren't listening to it when you were watching the movie. I actually remember hearing a couple of the songs outside of the film and tearing up a little bit because they were just so gosh darn beautiful. So really, if you're looking for like a high art science fiction movie, you can pick so many other ones that are better. In the Vast of Night, we just talked about it last week, far superior to this film. Really did not like it. Yeah, Claire Dennis, up your game. Not that anything I have to say matters, but there's just way too much inconsistency, and they were trying to cover way too much ground, and ultimately they didn't cover any ground at all. The film ends with Pattinson and his daughter getting into this little tiny spaceship and flying into a black hole or a wormhole or something, and him saying, like, "Are you ready?" And, like, it's in a weird, extra fatherly way, if that makes sense. It's creepy. And I did not dig it. And a lot of the violence was completely unnecessary. The explicit sexual content, I could understand some of it, at least being pertinent, but like really, it just doesn't make sense. And like, I made it through Sallow, which is, if you're into films, you know what Sallow is. Don't look it up if you're not into films. It is definitely, yeah, and don't watch it. If you haven't seen it, don't watch it. I mean, it's amazing, but you don't need to watch it. I made it through that film and was like, this is really good. This film is like trying to do a lot of similar things and just ultimately fails, like abysmally fails at them. So, in my opinion, not a movie to watch for any reason. But that's just my opinion, and I apologize for talking about it for an hour. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I appreciate you tuning in so that I could vent about how bad I thought this movie was. And even though it had plenty of meaningful and interesting things to say, it was still ultimately bad in my opinion. So I do apologize for, putting you through an hour-long podcast about a bad movie. So check out Vast of Night, check out Arrival, check out Annihilation. Vast of Night and Annihilation both are on Amazon. So you should definitely watch those instead of this. But that's all I've got for you guys this week. Make sure you give us a like, follow, subscribe, all that good stuff. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Stay safe out there, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.